it will work well. My wife says I have a really big mouth, and so I'll make sure and speak loudly. And, I need to thank Commissioner Costello first, because he was the one that stood up for us as taxpayers and shined light on the subject that the unions got smart and started giving their money to Republicans, and Republicans started waffling. So all of a sudden you had self-professed conservatives who were taking money from those that want more of your money and then trying to hide it from you. So Commissioner Costello needs to be commended for standing for principle. Even though there was payback for him doing so. So what I'd like to do is, I'm going to try to move quickly. And so to show you how cruel the people are that set up this event, they decided to have at the end of one of the nicest days that we will have in 2014, to have a certified public accountant talk to you about government spending and depress you for the next 2.5 hours. So if I take 2.5 hours, you are welcome to get your refund. You can tell them that I said you can have that, and no, I promise. My wife wants me home really soon, so we're not going to go for 2.5 hours. So let's get started. Have you ever heard David Barton before? Yeah. Raise your hand if you ever. Well, I disappoint you. I'm nowhere near as good as him. In fact, I'm just the opposite. The reason I mentioned David Barton is because I'm going to fly through my presentation. Oh. Okay. I'm going to try to fly through my presentation as fast as David Barton would. So if I talk about some numbers and you think, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous, what is he talking about? He doesn't know what he's talking about. Go ahead and raise your hand or let me know if that's unclear. So when we're talking about this topic of the growth and opportunity in Oklahoma, how can we turbocharge economic freedom in Oklahoma? And for those of you that don't know my background, like I said, I'm a CPA. That really stands for Can't Pass Again. That's kind of a joke. Having an accounting degree. I started out in government in 2003. I will apologize. I actually was one of those really dysfunctional people who can't socialize with the public at all. I was homeschooled from kindergarten all the way through high school, and went to a local community college and an UCO. So you can tell I really have trouble dealing with people. So what's the mission of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs? Our mission is to accumulate, evaluate, and disseminate public policy ideas and information for Oklahoma consistent with the principles of free enterprise, limited government, and individual initiative. And there's a reason that I read that. When you think about that mission statement, that's going to govern the rest of everything I say. So everyone, hold on, hold your breath. Breathe a sigh of relief, because I want to lead off today with a very good public policy statement. There has never been enough revenue for public education, and there never will be. That's the public policy prowess of the Tahlequah Public School Superintendent, Lisa Presley. So that's what you're up against as taxpayers. There's a friend of mine named Matt Merritt. He wrote a book called Taxpayers Don't Stand a Chance. And it's because of this very idea. This was an exact quote from the Tahlequah Public School Superintendent, which, interestingly enough, in the boom, they had their citizens bond out activity buses that would rival Greyhound shuttle buses. It's pretty incredible. I should have brought pictures for you today. So you've heard a lot about the doom and gloom, shortfall, it's the end of the world in Oklahoma, government doesn't have any money, we're not going to make it. Actually, that's not quite the case. If you can see that chart there, you can notice that in fiscal year 2003, the state of Oklahoma spent $10.6 billion. By fiscal year 2013, the state of Oklahoma increased to spending $17 billion. You're probably looking at this, and you're probably shocked and alarmed, and you're wondering, oh my goodness, what's going on? That CPA really must not know what he's doing, because that chart shows that spending never declined in Oklahoma, not even over the recession. And you will notice if you look at that bottom part there, that shows the party affiliation. You'll also notice that Spending is no respecter of party. Spending grows regardless of who's in party and regardless of their representations to you. So there's a lot of areas in government that have grown in spending. But the one that we're going to talk about that's most relevant is education. A lot of lawmakers are getting a lot of pushback that education is dying on the vine, that there is no money for education, that education has less money this year than it ever has before. But you can actually see, if you are so inclined and so bored today, once you leave on this beautiful day, if you go to the transparency website of the State Department of Ed, you will notice that total spending for state level spending for common education in Oklahoma, K through 12 schools, has increased every year since the start of the recession. In fact, in the recession that's known by many as the greatest recession since the Depression, spending in the prior year was never more than the following year in education. So even in education in Oklahoma, total spending has increased every single year. We were spending right at $6 billion during the 2008-2009 school year. We're now spending $6.3 billion in the 2012-2013 school year. You will hear a lot of talk about growth in enrollment. There's been several stories in the paper. There was a recent one. And you would think that we added, 1 million new children to public schools in the last 5 years if you hear the reports. Actually, according to the State Department of Ed, our enrollment increase over the last 5 years is right at around 27,000 students. Now again, that still kind of sounds like a lot, but you've got to put numbers in context. Starting in fiscal year 2008, the number of students that were enrolled in schools, or the average daily attendance, was 596,000. So an increase of about 27,000 students, that's only an increase of right at around 4%. Hardly enough to cause a lemming-like rush on the schools where they cannot keep children in classrooms and where now you have student-teacher ratios of 1 to 100. That's what the news reports would have you think, but that's actually not what's going on. But there's something else that's going on too, and so even if you want to use a different number, if you want to use, they love to use the October 1 enrollment number because that's a snapshot in time and that gives them a higher number. Even if you use that number, enrollment has still only grown right at around 28,000 students across the state. And remember, we're talking about enrollment of over 500,000 students. Again, we're talking about enrollment that's still right at around 4%. So then let's talk about per pupil spending, as if per pupil spending mattered, because if you spend more on education, then DC, where they spend close to $30,000 per student, should have the highest and best schools in the nation. And as you know, that's not the case. But as you can tell in Oklahoma, per pupil spending since the recession was increasing at small levels, and then we got to the recession. Then in 2011, 2012, it peaked a little bit, and now it's come back down right at around $40. Now again, if you read the papers, you'll hear the doom and gloom, and you would think that, total spending has been cut on education by thousands of dollars, and children now are having to walk to school instead of ride the bus, and that all teachers have been fired. But that's actually not the case. If you look at the data, per pupil spending in Oklahoma has declined right at around $46 out of over $10.2 a year. And guess what that percentage amounts to? It's of a change of right at around 0.46%. So hardly an amount for doom and gloom. If you use their number that they like to use when they want to try to inflate appropriations, use the enrollment number, even that number shows a very small amount. But here's something that's going on that they're not talking to you about. Remember that education is a partnership between the state and local government. That's the way it exists right now. Definitely there's things that we would recommend changing about that. Most people are not aware of the fact that in 2008, in 2008, total local revenues going to schools was $1.7 billion. For the most recent year that we have data, 2013, local revenue is $3.098 billion. If you're wondering how much that means that our schools in Oklahoma have now an extra $350 million a year to spend at the local level. You're not hearing a lot of talk about that when they're talking about the fact that state appropriations have relatively remained flat per student. So that means you and your local districts combined all together are giving schools an extra $350 million a year. That's something that's not being talked about. But yet it's being made to seem like spending on education is being cut. You saw from the first chart that that's nowhere near the case. In fact, per pupil local revenue has increased from $2,900 roughly per student to over $3,300 per student in just a 5-year period. What's amazing is that local revenue, again, per student never declined. Total local revenue for schools never declined in Oklahoma, even over the recession. And so let's talk a little bit about reality. So what's happened? Per pupil spending has soared in Oklahoma since the 1990s. Remember when, for those of you that are older, the House Bill 1017, remember that was going to be the first thing that was going to save education. We were going to dedicate all this money to education, it was going to save it. And since that time, significant increases in per pupil spending have been added. And as you can tell from this chart, this is per pupil spending. This is work that we did in collaboration with the Cato Institute. And this number is ACT scores. Relatively flat, even dipping in some years. But yet spending has increased per pupil at incredible levels, almost 50%. Nationally, what's going on? The total cost for K through 12 education skyrocketing when adjusted for inflation from 1970 to 2012. Almost increased by 200%. Employees at schools are skyrocketing, but yet scores are flat. Math, reading, math, science, those scores are all flat. And so the question that I have to ask, and you probably saw it earlier, is when will we as citizens and when will lawmakers stop believing that Lucy is actually going to let us kick the football? She never lets Charlie Brown kick the football. And as the superintendent, the good superintendent said, public education has never had enough revenue and it will never have enough revenue. And so that's why at OCPA we propose and we think it's time to change the discussion. So let's look at total state tax collections. From fiscal year 2003, total state tax collections were $5.7 billion. By fiscal year 2013, they were $7.8 billion. Revenues are at all-time highs. You're not hearing that from the media and the liberal editorial boards, but the state has more money to spend than it's ever had to spend, and it's spending more than it's ever spent, as you saw from the other chart. Guess what? Even though Oklahoma has cut its personal income tax rate by 25% over the last decade, we are now collecting more personal income taxes in Oklahoma than we ever have in history. In fact, personal income tax collections in Oklahoma only declined even after the tax cuts right there in the period of the recession. That's the only time that there was a decline. But there's something else that's going on, and it goes to the benefit of tax cuts. Something phenomenal has happened in Oklahoma in state sales tax collections. Sales tax collections in Oklahoma were right at $1.4 billion just 10 years ago. They are now at $2.28 billion. To give you an idea, the state now has $870 million more, or 62% more to spend from sales taxes than it did 10 years ago. Isn't it a coincidence that that's over the same period that the state significantly cut income taxes and gave you citizens the opportunity to use your money as you see fit? We think that's a powerful story for Oklahoma to tell. To give you an idea of how significant this growth is in state sales tax collections, which is a good thing, population growth was just 9% over that period. Inflation growth was just 27%. Even personal income growth was just 39%, which is still a good number. Yet state sales tax collections have grown 62% over that period of time. I suggest to you that Oklahoma's experience with tax cuts from the fiscal year, basically 2005 to 2012, is a good testament that you as citizens know a lot better how to employ your capital than what lawmakers will ever be able to come up with. If you look at the sales tax growth rate, now I'm just going to get really nerdy on you. The sales tax growth rate is much faster now than it was before the tax cuts. So why are groups like OCPA, OCPA Impact, AFP, Oklahoma, Heritage Actions, and others across the nation and the Fair Talks talking about getting rid of the income tax? When we did a joint study with Dr. Art Laffer, we found that if Oklahoma would phase out its income tax over a 10-year period, Oklahoma would have the lowest tax burden of any state except Alaska. We would jump our annual personal income growth rate to 5.6% over the 2.3% that it would currently be. So we would essentially double our personal income growth. We would grow personal income by $47 billion in Oklahoma. So what would happen to GDP growth in Oklahoma? It would grow at an annual rate of 5.4%. Again, nearly double what it currently is right now. Our total GDP would grow by almost 50%, $53 billion over a 10-year period. We would add 312,000 more jobs if we had begun it in 2013 and did it over a 10-year period. To give you an idea of what it would look like for some people that are in the various income tax brackets, if we eliminated the income tax and you made $30,000 a year, that's a savings of $950 a year. If you're a family of four and your gross income is $50,000 a year, that's a savings of $1,300. And you can see as your income goes up, because you pay more in taxes, that's more for you to save. Raise your hand if you think that would even kickstart and make Oklahoma's economy even better. Obviously, the benefits to the state would be that it would be elimination of the individual income tax. It would increase work and production. Obviously, it would be even better because the overall cost of government to the taxpayer would be reduced. We get this lesson, I don't have time to go through it today, but if you look at the no income tax states, they have better job growth, state revenue growth, employment growth, personal income growth than the states with the highest tax rates, and even the nation, and even Oklahoma. And so finally we get to this topic of, what's Johnathan Small's interest in this? I told you I was a CPA. Recommending getting rid of the income tax is going to put a lot of my friends out of work because they won't be able to make money filing state tax returns anymore. That's my interest, is the future of Oklahoma and the small household. My four daughters, Jasmine, Savannah, Hayden, and Brooklyn, who are all under 8. And I submit to you that there's ways to cut spending in government. Oklahoma has our budget book that we put out every year. We've recommended a plan to amend or change the pension systems so that we can free up revenues to spend them on core services and do tax cuts. Those are all things that can happen. Cutting and eliminating Oklahoma's income tax is a possibility if lawmakers will prioritize taxpayers over tax consumers. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions and turn it over to Dave if we need to leave.
Thanks to everyone who's been with us today. We do have some time for a few questions. If anyone has any, bring the mic.
This is a concern. Concerning the small businessman, I found out that when you pay up capital money, you can get rid of that, you get out of it. But I wonder what we are, where we are at in the state today, and both the state, the county, and city, as to what our real debt is. We're talking about balanced budget, we really have a lot of debt.
You know, I think that you bring up a really good question. I think part of it is that citizens are going to have to become much better aware. A policy idea that Oklahoma is working on right now is moving school board and other school finance elections either to the municipal voting date or to November. There was a story about a school district where they passed a $500,000 bond issue with 6 votes. And, you know, we've got to see our local citizens become more aware of what's going on. And part of the thing that we need to see is we need to see those local votes be moved to a date where people can actually pay attention to them and know what's going on. But you asked a great question. We're going to all have to encourage and demand better transparency out of our local governments. The state is trying to do a better job of putting in one place where you can go and look at all the debt that the state has. But right now, as Senator Brinkley talked about, and the legislature is actually doing a good job working on this, our total pension liability is $11 billion. You know, states, they don't print money. They overpromise pensions and rack up liabilities and wait for someone to have to come pay for it and deal with it in the future, like what's going on with Detroit. So that's where we're going to have to see a better level of transparency and see the state move to a defined contribution plan for non-hazard duty employees.
Johnathan, up here on your
Thank you. Enjoying your talk very much. Appreciate the truth you're shedding on some issues here. Have you and your organization studied any of the effects that eliminating some of the tax breaks on the deep drilling, horizontal drilling for oil and gas wells, that some of these wells cost up to $15 million, maybe more, the effect that would have on business in general and income and jobs and that sort of thing for the state? Because I know there's an attempt to eliminate that exemption for some of the gross production tax, which is 7%. And I know it brings a lot of money in, but it's a real critical issue to the state, I think. We need some light shed on that issue.
You know, you bring up a great point. You know, OCPA impact, our greatest concern with the discussion about the rate on horizontal drilling is that when this whole discussion started, it started with bureaucrats complaining that revenue growth wasn't up to their overestimate, and the fact that even though we had record high revenues with a really bad national economy where you as taxpayers had lost, all of us basically saw a loss of income from an increase in the payroll tax. We all are seeing our health insurance premiums increase because of Obamacare. And so our number one concern, even before you look at how much money is contributed by this sector or that sector, is that government has record revenues at all-time highs. Everyone say that with me, all-time highs. Government has more money than it's ever had to spend in the state of Oklahoma, and they're talking about raising taxes on you and other sectors. It's just nonsensical, and I think that's where we first start with the discussion. Obviously, there's also the issue of, you know, since when was it a bad thing to have the lowest tax rate in a certain area? I'm trying to figure out how that's a problem. Why don't we lower all the other rates to a low rate as well so we can burst the economy and give people back more of their own money, regardless of whatever the sector is? And I think that's what the shift of the focus needs to be on, and not whether or not, you know, all the complaining from everyone that wants to raise the gross production tax, it's all, make no mistake, don't be deceived. They don't want to raise the gross production tax to try to offset it and eliminate the personal income tax. They're all trying to peg whatever number of total new spending that they want to create this next year and take more money from another sector. And that's all that discussion is really about.
I think we almost had an altar call all-time highs right there.
Sir, I don't know if you remember meeting with me, but I brought to your attention the fact that this county, which is the highest tax county in the state, donates every year a ton of money to school systems who have a year-and-a-half supply of money already in the bank. We have the best tech schools in the whole United States, in the world maybe, and we keep stuffing money in their account so much that they can't spend it. And I know you went out statewide and looked at some of the stuff I brought to your attention. Can you address that a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Assessor Gaisley. You're exactly right. That's part of that gigantic revenue growth that we've seen. What that chart that I showed you where local revenue had grown for K through 12 schools by over $350 million a year, that was just K through 12 schools. That didn't even get to career techs or what's happening with local community colleges. Across the state, local revenues are growing because citizens' incomes are growing and because they're working harder and building better and nicer houses and making housing improvements. So there is no funding crisis in any level of education in Oklahoma. In fact, as you saw from those charts, the performance in schools at best is flat, and spending is nearly twofold across the board. So it's definitely something that we have to be aware of as citizens, and these are the kinds of things that you need to be telling your lawmaker when people try to show up at the Capitol on March 31st in those activity buses that they bonded out to complain that their school doesn't have enough revenue when they spend $500,000 on buses that look like buses that the OU football team rides in.
I see that all of your charts show there was no decrease in money to education.
Greg, hold it up a little bit closer.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Okay. That there was no decrease in funding to education. Is there some way to, how do you initiate an audit? Because I have friends in public education here in Tulsa, and they have just seen such waste and inaccountability. How do we hold them? Is there some method of getting an audit where we can audit the efficiency and the bureaucracy part of it so that the money actually gets to the teachers and the students?
I think that what I would say is that this is a really good question, and that's what we need to be asking lawmakers to do. They have education and appropriation and budget oversight committees, and those lawmakers and their staffs need to be doing that, and they have the ability to do that. They have the easiest and fastest access to that information. I have the privilege of being able to work for OCPA, so I had the time to go on the state website and gather this information. But you're exactly right. I shouldn't have had to put this information together. Lawmakers should be carrying this around and saying, I don't need to increase spending on your favorite area of government. Look, we've been increasing spending and outcomes are the same. And so I think that we've got to all press on our local lawmakers that we want them to hold spending accountable when they're making appropriations every year. They have the ability to do it.
Closer. All right. I really wanted to get the microphone just to say that Lisa Presley is an aunt by marriage, and I appreciate the fact that she made the slideshow. It always makes for interesting conversations at family dinners. Anyway, I was looking on the website the other day for some kind of position paper on the size of the independent schools that we have in our state. We have something like 520 to 530 independent school districts. And I was wondering about how you felt that played a role in spending, and if OCPA has really looked into that.
I do know. I think that one of the things to do is to look at our neighbor to the south that has no income tax, where they made significant reductions in the number of school districts. Still allowed schools to exist, but they said that we're going to get rid of bureaucracy. That's an effort that needs to happen in Oklahoma. I'll tell you though that's not. Times are different now. When Texas did this, when Texas realized it was too large and it had too many different forms of government spread across too many different areas of the state, this was back, decades ago. There's now a built-in constituency. So this is going to have to start at the local level. And at the local level, when citizens go and they vote in school board elections, they're going to have to ask those people that are voting, do you think education has enough money? Yes or no?
Yes.
And if they tell you no, they don't have enough money, then whatever else they say, if they tell you they're opposed to Common Core and everything else, they'll have all the right answers on everything else. But if they won't tell you that education has enough money, then you need to look at another candidate. One of the things that I want to mention, because I briefly mentioned Common Core, and this is just a freedom discussion for a moment. Government's greatest ability to ruin your life is its ability to, at the threat of gunpoint, take and steal from you and your family the bread that you have earned and the labor that you have earned. And that's one of the reasons why we at OCPA have put a huge focus on the income tax. As long as government is getting more and more of your money, then they can do things like pass really bad school policy that you don't like. Because as long as they control where your kid goes to school and they continue to take more and more of your money, what you say after that really doesn't matter. Because once you defeat Common Core, there'll be something else that they'll come up with that's a really bad idea. And so that's why we've got to focus on allowing us as citizens to keep more of the income that we have. And then we don't have to worry about bad policy because they'll never have the money to implement the bad policy to begin with.
I think we have time for one more question. If we have any, folks may be ready to go. We have one more over here.
I know education's nice to fund, but I'll facetiously say, when the state's got these important state lodges that we just have to fund, or shiny new choo-choo trains now to run to Tulsa, at what point do we look at, what's an essential service? Does your organization look at state services and grade anything from a standpoint of essential role of state government?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's part of my job, part of Dave's job. I'll tell you, lawmakers in Oklahoma will get you all fired up about earmarks in D.C., and then they'll forget to tell you about the earmarks that they pass in Oklahoma's budget. We fund roping contests, rodeos, golf courses, resorts that could never stay up on their own 2 feet, that compete against the private sector. We list all of those. Actually, did you know that your taxpayer dollars are going to a special earmark for a special aquarium that's not that far from here, even though the Oklahoma City and Tulsa zoos are entirely funded by local funding? So we put together a budget book that points out all of those earmarks. Of the ones that we could find last year in what was supposedly a tough economic year for the state based on the way people talk, at least over $8.3 million in earmarks were given out that we could find. And totally ridiculous non-force funding of services. The kind of stuff that would be in Tom Coburn's book that he writes at the federal level, that's what's going on in Oklahoma.
Do you have that published on the web?
Yes, if you go to our website, www.ocpathink.org, and then go to our policy papers, our budget book is one of the first that's in that list. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Ron.